Welcome everyone to this lecture on using TensorFlow for variables and placeholders. So there's really two main types of tensor objects in a TensorFlow graph, and we're going to talk about variables and placeholders, and these should feel already familiar based off the last section of the course. During the optimization process, TensorFlow tunes the parameters of the model to try to get a better fit on your training data. And variables can hold the values of weights and biases throughout the session. Variables do need to be initialized, so when you're running your session, you're going to run a line command that initializes all the variables that you've already defined. Now let's talk about placeholders. Placeholders, as we've already discussed, are initially empty and they're used to feed in the actual training examples, that is, your actual data that you're training your model on. However, you should note that they do need a declared expected data type, for example tf.float32, with an optional shape argument. So what the placeholder is doing, it's going to be empty at first, essentially a placeholder, and then your data is going to be fed into that placeholder, a lot of times in small batches. So that placeholder needs to know mainly two things: what the data type is going to look like, whether it's going to be an integer, a floating point number, etc. And then it also needs to know the shape of the data. Alright, let's go ahead and see some examples of each, and then once we understand placeholders and variables, we're going to be ready to build our first model of TensorFlow. Let's open up a Jupyter Notebook. Alright, so just very quickly I'm going to show you the syntax used in TensorFlow for variables and placeholders. And I'm just actually going to create an interactive session here. So I'll say tf interactive session. That way I can run all of this in different cells. So we'll say my tensor is equal to, and let's go ahead and create a tensor of, let's say, random uniform. So we'll say random uniform, and we're going to make this be a 4x4. And if we take a look, we'll say minimum value is 0, maximum value is 1. So now I have this tensor. So if I take a look at it, my tensor, it's this random uniform tensor, float32. So notice here it has a float32 data type. So then I'm going to create a variable, and this is going to be tf variable. And if you take a look at the initial arguments here, you have an initial value, trainable, collections, etc. Mainly all we have to do is just tell it the actual initial value. So we'll say initial value is equal to my tensor. The rest of that can be under defaults. So now if I say print my variable, I now have tf variable. So if I actually want to run this variable, so if I say session run my variable, you'll notice you get a failure here. And that's because, as I mentioned in the slides, you need to initialize your variables. So you're going to see us run initialize lines pretty much in every single model we build. So the way you do that, let me hashtag comment this out first, is you need to say init is equal to tf, and you'll say global variables initializer, open and close parentheses. And then what you need to do is run this initializer first. So we'll say that session.run, and a lot of times you'll see us run this initialization with session, but right now we're just doing interactive session. So I need to run this initialization, so we'll say ses.run init, and now all these variables have been initialized, so I should be able to run this line again. And hopefully now I see that 4x4 matrix of random uniform numbers. And there it is, 4x4 random numbers. So again, key thing to note here is when you're creating a variable and you intend to use it in your session, you're going to need to initialize all these variables. And it's quite simple. After you create all your variables, you just set this init to .global variables initializer, and then somewhere in your session you're going to run it. And that allows you to run all these variables and the operations that depend on them. Placeholders look really similar. So I'm just going to make a really simple placeholder here. ph is equal to, we'll say tf, placeholder, and then mainly the thing you need to say is what data type to expect and what shape to expect. So for instance, a lot of times we can just say tf, we'll say float32 or float64. Generally for us, 32 bits of information is more than enough for all our training, and then depending on what shape you expect, you can say shape is equal to something like none or 4, or maybe 4x4, etc. That really depends on the data itself, so we're going to cover that in a little more detail later on, but for now we can just say there is no shape, and then we have our placeholder. Okay, So again, those are variables and placeholders. So really, the thing you need to remember out of this lecture is that once you create a variable, before you run it in your session, you need to initialize all the variables. Placeholders, essentially the same thing. You need to provide a data type. And as far as the shape, it's really common to have a shape that looks, as far as the tuple is concerned, something like none, comma, 5. And the reason a lot of times, if you're looking stuff up in the documentation, you see placeholders with this first one being none, is because none, as this first one, can be filled with the actual number of samples in the data, which if you're feeding it in batches, you may not know beforehand before creating the placeholder. So a lot of times you'll see that none, and that'll be more clear as we create our own models in TensorFlow. All right, now that we understand this, we're ready to build our first model, which we're going to do in the next lecture. I'll see you there.